They are embarrassed and mad at you, your silence humbled them. There comes a point in the avoidance experience that few people ever get to see. Most avoidants never speak about it, rarely acknowledge it, and often do everything they can to avoid facing it themselves. It does not happen the moment you pull away. In the beginning, their protective mechanisms are still working overtime, convincing them that your silence is temporary. They assume the familiar cycle will eventually restart. Part of them believes you will reach out again, that the connection is merely on pause rather than truly changing. But as the days pass and the silence remains, something begins to shift. The messages never come. The pursuit never resumes. Gradually, the realization settles in that you have genuinely stepped away from the exhausting effort of chasing someone who continually kept emotional distance. When that truth finally sinks in, it creates one of the most complicated emotional experiences an avoidant can face. It is not a simple feeling of loss. It is a tangled mix of pride, longing, shame, ego, confusion, and emotional vulnerability all colliding at once. At the center of this internal conflict is a realization that many avoidants find incredibly difficult to tolerate. They begin to recognize that your decision to stop pursuing them changed the balance of the dynamic in a way they never expected. You did not set out to prove a point. You did not force a confrontation. You did not try to make them feel small. You simply chose to value yourself enough to stop participating in a pattern that was draining you. Yet that single decision often affects them more deeply than any argument ever could. Today, I want to take you inside that hidden experience because understanding it can provide something far more useful than momentary satisfaction. While a certain amount of satisfaction may naturally arise, the greater value is clarity. It helps explain what truly happened between you, what may still be unfolding beneath the surface, and how the journey towards silence transformed you long before it ever affected them. One of the most overlooked emotions in avoidance psychology is embarrassment. People often focus on fear of intimacy, fear of vulnerability, or fear of commitment, but embarrassment plays a surprisingly powerful role once the silence becomes real. To understand why, you have to understand the identity many avoidants unconsciously create within relationships. Beneath the surface, there's often a deeply rooted belief that they are the less dependent person. They see themselves as the one who can walk away more easily, the one who remains less emotionally invested, and the one who maintains greater control over closeness. This belief is rarely spoken aloud because it operates quietly in the background. It becomes part of how they understand themselves and their relationships. They withdraw when emotions become intense. They create distance when connection begins to feel overwhelming. They offer warmth and affection, then pull back when things become too close. Over time, these patterns reinforce the idea that they are the person with the power to engage or disengage whenever they choose. As long as you continued reaching for them, that internal story remained intact. Every message, every attempt to reconnect, every effort to bridge the emotional gap seemed to confirm their belief that they were the less affected person. The dynamic appeared to support the narrative they had built around themselves. They could point to your visible desire for connection and quietly interpret it as evidence that they held the stronger position emotionally. Whether consciously or unconsciously, this reinforced their sense of control. But the moment your silence became permanent enough to feel real, that entire framework began to crack. You did not challenge it through confrontation. You did not demand answers or issue ultimatums. Instead, you stepped away and allowed your absence to speak for itself. And in doing so, you removed the foundation that had been supporting their self-image all along. What makes this so impactful is that it forces them to confront a possibility they were never prepared for. The possibility that they were not as detached, unaffected, or emotionally independent as they believed themselves to be. You did not challenge them with accusations. You did not create a dramatic ending that would have allowed them to retreat behind familiar defenses or explain away their discomfort. Instead, you simply withdrew your energy from a connection that was no longer honoring your value. That quiet decision changed everything. The story they had been telling themselves suddenly lost its foundation. The person they assumed would always remain emotionally invested stopped reaching. The person they expected to keep holding the connection together stepped back. And now, the avoidant is left sitting with something they never anticipated. A sense of absence that feels suspiciously like need. That is where the embarrassment lies. It is the uncomfortable realization that they were not as detached as they believed. The version of themselves that felt unaffected and fully in control begins to crack under the weight of a truth they never prepared for. Somewhere beneath all the defenses is the recognition that your presence mattered far more than they allowed themselves to admit. What makes this realization even more difficult is the way you left. There was no emotional explosion, no desperate final plea, no dramatic confrontation. You exited with composure. You chose your dignity instead of continuing to fight for a place in someone's life that was never being offered freely. That quiet self-respect creates a unique kind of discomfort for the avoidant. When someone they hurt responds with grace rather than chaos, there is nowhere for them to redirect their guilt or frustration. They are left alone with it. In many ways, being outmatched in dignity by the person they failed to appreciate becomes one of the hardest truths to process. It lingers longer than they expect. It returns in unexpected moments. And unlike many other uncomfortable emotions, it refuses to disappear through distance alone. The silence keeps reminding them of who walked away and how they walked away. Then there is the anger. This is important to understand because many people mistakenly assume an avoidance anger means they were justified or that your silence somehow caused harm. In reality, the anger often comes from something entirely different. They are angry because the dynamic changed in a way they did not anticipate. Not because you broke an agreement, but because you stopped participating in a pattern they had quietly come to depend on. They grew accustomed to your availability. They assumed the connection would remain accessible whenever they felt comfortable engaging. They expected your investment to continue outweighing their own. Without consciously acknowledging it, they relied on a structure that protected them from vulnerability while allowing them to benefit from your consistency. The moment your silence became permanent enough to feel real, that structure collapsed. And anger became one of the first emotional reactions to emerge from the rubble. The difficult truth is that this anger is often rooted in entitlement, which is why it feels so uncomfortable for them to examine honestly. Deep down, many avoidants understand that they cannot reasonably blame someone for choosing self-respect. They cannot easily justify being upset that another person stopped accepting emotional inconsistency. To explain their anger fully would require acknowledging assumptions they would rather not face. They would have to admit they expected you to remain available regardless of how little they offered in return. They would have to recognize ways they may have taken your presence for granted. That kind of self-awareness can be deeply unsettling because it clashes with the image they have of themselves as thoughtful, reasonable, and emotionally aware individuals. As a result, the anger often has nowhere comfortable to go. It cannot be directed outward with legitimacy, and it cannot be fully accepted inward without significant self-reflection. Beneath the embarrassment and beneath the anger lies the emotion that matters most. It is quieter, softer, and far more painful than either of the others. It is grief. Not theoretical grief. Not abstract sadness. Real grief for the connection they had, the moments they shared with you, and the possibilities that now exist only in memory. This is often the emotion avoidants spend the most energy trying to avoid. Their relationship with grief is incredibly complicated because grief requires direct contact with loss. It requires acknowledging value. It requires admitting that something meaningful existed and that it is no longer available in the same way. For someone whose defenses are built around minimizing emotional dependence, that can feel overwhelming. Yet, when the silence lasts long enough, grief often finds its way through the cracks anyway. And when it does, it forces them to confront not only what they lost, but also the possibility that their own patterns played a significant role in losing it. For an avoidant person, grief is especially difficult because grief demands something they spend much of their life trying not to confront. It requires admitting that something mattered. It requires recognizing that a loss hurts because what was lost had real value. And that realization stands in direct opposition to the story many avoidants tell themselves about being completely self-reliant and unaffected. To fully grieve, they would have to acknowledge that you mattered deeply, that the connection held significance, and that your absence is not easily replaced. They would have to face the possibility that what slipped away was not simply another relationship among many, but something unique that carried a meaning they did not fully appreciate while they had it. That is not an easy truth for someone whose defenses are built around emotional distance. Yet, your silence gradually brings that truth into view. It is important to understand that this grief is not caused because silence is some clever technique meant to provoke an emotional reaction. The silence being discussed here is not manipulation. It simply removes the distractions that once allowed the avoidant to stay disconnected from their deeper feelings. While you were still reaching out, there was always something to focus on. They could manage the dynamic, calculate the appropriate amount of distance, monitor your responses, and remain occupied by the ongoing movement of the relationship. All of that activity created noise, but when you stopped participating, the noise disappeared. Suddenly, there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to control, and nothing left to monitor. What remained was a quiet space where your absence became impossible to ignore. In that space, the emotions they had successfully avoided often begin rising to the surface. When all of these emotions arrive at once, embarrassment, anger, longing, grief, and the unsettling awareness of how much they actually cared, the avoidance response tends to follow a predictable pattern. The first reaction is usually more distance. This may seem confusing from the outside, but psychologically, it makes perfect sense. When overwhelming feelings begin pushing through their defenses, their instinct is often to rely even more heavily on the coping strategy that has always provided temporary relief. They create additional space. They emphasize independence. They reinforce the image of not needing anyone. To observers, this can easily look like indifference. It can appear as though they have moved on effortlessly, or were never affected at all, but appearances can be misleading. Often, the increased distance is not evidence that they feel nothing. It is evidence that what they are feeling has become difficult to manage. They retreat not because the emotions are absent, but because the emotions are becoming impossible to ignore. This phase requires tremendous effort from the avoidant. Maintaining the appearance of composure while wrestling with unresolved feelings is emotionally exhausting. The further they attempt to push those feelings away, the more energy it takes to sustain the illusion that everything is fine. Eventually, however, a second stage often emerges. After enough time passes, many avoidants enter a period of reflection that happens almost against their will. Defenses can delay emotional processing, but they rarely eliminate it forever. In the quieter moments of life, when distractions are limited and the mind begins wandering, thoughts of you start appearing with greater honesty. It may happen during a sleepless night, a quiet morning, a drive, or a routine task that leaves room for reflection. In those moments, memories return. Not the broad outlines of the relationship, but the specific details that carry emotional weight. They begin remembering conversations that lingered in their mind long after they ended. They think about moments when they felt truly understood. They revisit memories of times when the walls briefly came down and genuine connection was allowed to exist. They remember how you saw parts of them that few people ever reached. They think about the comfort, acceptance, and familiarity that developed between you. More importantly, they begin examining what happened to all of it. They look back at the distancing, the inconsistency, the missed opportunities, and the repeated cycles that slowly damaged the connection. What once felt abstract becomes personal. The consequences of their actions are no longer theories. They become realities. And those realities often feel heavier than they expected. This is where true humility begins. Not as a performance designed to win someone back, but as a private reckoning with choices that cannot be undone and losses that suddenly feel very real. Before ending this conversation, I want to bring the focus back to you. We have spent considerable time exploring what may be happening inside the avoidant, but your growth matters far more than their reaction. The silence that changes an avoidant is rarely born from strategy. It is not usually a calculated move designed to create longing or regret. More often it comes from reaching a limit. It comes from the exhaustion of investing endlessly into a connection that continually failed to meet you with the same level of commitment. It comes from the moment when hope can no longer outweigh reality. When that moment arrives, silence becomes less about them and more about you. It becomes a declaration that your energy, your time, and your emotional well-being deserve protection. It marks the point where you stop building your life around someone else's inconsistency and begin building it around your own self-respect. That is why your silence carries such power. Not because it forces another person to feel something, but because it reflects a transformation within you. It communicates a truth that no argument, explanation, or emotional plea could ever express with the same strength. It says that you finally recognize your own value. Not as a slogan or an affirmation, but as something real and lived. It says that your worth is no longer dependent on whether someone chooses to acknowledge it. It says that you are no longer willing to sacrifice yourself for a connection that requires you to constantly prove your importance. And regardless of what happens inside the avoidant from this point forward, that realization remains the most important outcome of all. Because the deepest purpose of your silence was never to change them. It was to bring you back to yourself. The avoidant may feel embarrassed. They may feel frustrated, unsettled, or quietly humbled by what your silence has revealed to them. But beneath all of those reactions lies another emotion that often goes unnoticed. In some of the deepest and most honest parts of their inner world, there is also a growing sense of respect. In fact, they may respect you more now than they have respected anyone in a very long time. That may sound surprising, especially after everything that happened, but it makes sense when you understand what many avoidants admire most. They place enormous value on independence, self-control, and emotional self-possession. These qualities are often central to how they define themselves. Yet by stepping away from a dynamic that was no longer serving you, you demonstrated those qualities in a way that was impossible to ignore. You embodied the very strength they have spent years trying to cultivate, but you expressed it with a level of consistency that they themselves struggled to maintain throughout the relationship. The difference is impossible for them not to notice. Their withdrawal often came wrapped in confusion and contradiction. There were periods of closeness followed by distance, warmth followed by detachment, moments of connection interrupted by walls that seemed to appear without warning. Their exits and retreats carried uncertainty, mixed signals, and unresolved tension. Your departure, however, carried none of that. You did not disappear through games or emotional maneuvering. You did not create confusion. You simply made a decision and stood by it. There was a clarity to your silence that communicated certainty. There was a calmness to it that reflected self-respect rather than resentment. And whether they acknowledge it openly or not, that level of conviction leaves a lasting impression. It becomes something difficult to forget because it represents a kind of emotional integrity that commands attention even in silence. What often surprises people is that respect can grow even when communication stops. The avoidant may never express it directly. They may never call you and admit what they learned from losing access to you. Yet, internally, many of them recognize the significance of what happened. They understand that you reached a point where you stopped negotiating your worth. You stopped asking for what should have been offered freely. You stopped sacrificing your peace for the possibility of receiving consistency someday. Those realizations matter because they force the avoidant to see you differently. No longer as someone who will endlessly accommodate uncertainty, but as someone who possesses clear boundaries and enough self-respect to honor them. That shift in perception can be profound. It changes the way they remember you, and it changes the meaning they assign to your absence. Most importantly, your silence communicated something that words often fail to express. You did not try to punish them. You did not turn your pain into an argument or your disappointment into a demand. You did not chase validation, beg for understanding, or fight for recognition. Instead, you allowed your actions to speak for you. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that no longer aligned with your value. That choice carried a message stronger than any confrontation ever could. It said that you finally understood what you deserved, and that you were no longer willing to compromise that understanding. It demonstrated confidence without arrogance, strength without aggression, and self-respect without hostility. And that is why your silence leaves such a lasting impact. Not because it forces someone to regret losing you, although that may happen. Not because it guarantees reflection, although it often creates space for it. Its true power comes from what it represents. It represents the moment you stop defining yourself through someone else's inability to meet you fully. It represents the moment you chose yourself. Long after conversations fade and emotions settle, that is the part that remains. The avoidant may forget many details of the relationship, but they rarely forget the person who quietly walked away with dignity intact. They rarely forget the person who responded to inconsistency not with chaos, but with clarity. And they rarely forget the lesson that your silence ultimately taught them. That genuine self-worth does not need to argue for its value. It simply recognizes it, honors it, and refuses to settle for anything less.